Okay, hello everyone. My name is Erica Richardson. I am co-director of the Black Studies Colloquium, and you are at the first session of Black Futures Symposium, Black Ecologies. So a couple of things for people to know as you're coming in, you may have to rename yourself. Just take a moment to click on your own image, the three dots. You'll have a option of renaming, putting in your pronouns, whatever you prefer. I'm also going to let you know, much as you may have guessed from the voice that we just heard, that we are recording. This is so that people can have access to this at a later date. And of course, for our students to create their critical responses, something I'm going to talk more about in just a moment. The last thing you need to know as we enter this Zoom session is how to choose the language or interpretation you would like to hear. So if you go down to the bottom of your Zoom screen, there's going to be an icon that says interpretation. You might have to access this by clicking the more button, but it'll be the bottom of your screen and you choose the language of interpretation you would prefer. So I'm just going to give you a moment to look for that and again, choose that audio option. And also, if you have any questions throughout, whether it's tech-wise or just ideas that are occurring to you, you are more than welcome to drop them in the chat. You will be muted throughout the majority of the speaking portion, but once we get to the Q&A, we will see people either digitally raise hands, choose the raise hand button, kind of wave at us. We're excited to hear your voices, but you will be automatically muted until we start. Okay. So again, as I said, my name is Erica Richardson. I am co-director of the Black Studies Colloquium, and this is our first session of the Black Futures Symposium, Black Ecologies. So this symposium is part of an ongoing public knowledge project that began last spring, Black Futures, Black Studies, Black Ecologies, and African Social Research. This public knowledge program began with the Provost Innovation and Research Grant. And with that funding and support from Baruch, we were able to create a series of events interrogating and thinking more about Black ecologies, Black futures, Black studies, and African social research. Our events last spring included topics such as histories and ecologies and philosophies of maroon communities, anti-racist pedagogy, Black feminism and aquatic life, and scavenging as a means of interrupting racial capitalism. To see these events or to learn more about what we've done in the past, I'm going to drop the link to our site into the chat. Oops, hold on one moment. So many screens, so little time. And following these events, we had student research. Student research in the form of a program we're calling Black Futures Scholars. So with Black Futures Scholars, we help support students in their critical and creative responses to the ideas, content, and questions that emerge across our programming. In this way, we're really trying to think about not only do we form conversations within our community and beyond, but also think about our students as participating in that conversation. With a topic and an idea such as Black ecologies, it is central and integral to consider how do our students think about these topics? What do Black ecologies mean to them? What does it look like in their lives? And how might we expand our conversation by making them a part of our work? This semester, with the support of the Black Race Ethnic Studies Initiative, or what is called the BRESI grant, we are further supporting students, asking them to respond to the content today and our other presentations. And we'll have workshops focusing on podcasts, video blogs, creative work that students want to create to respond to this. And if they're selected, they will get a cash award of up to $300. So if you are interested, if your students are interested, please, please, please share. Please, please, please encourage them to apply to attend some of our workshops, which we'll be scheduling next week, or send a schedule out, I should say, next week to tell you more about. And to that end, I am also dropping the chat a link about our Black Futures Scholars Program as well. So at this point, I would like to hand things over to my incredible colleague and co-director of the Black Studies Colloquium, Professor Rojo Robles.
Thank you, Erica, and good afternoon, everybody. Buenas tardes. And from my part, also welcome to the first session of the Black Studies Colloquium Symposium, Black Futures. Yeah, again, I am Dr. Rojo Robles. I am an assistant professor in the Department of Black and Latino Studies and co-director with Dr. Erica Richardson of the Black Studies Colloquium. This afternoon, we have the pleasure of engaging with Cristina Sturmer. She's a researcher and activist of the Landless Rural Workers Movement, MST, based in the Santa Maria settlement in Paranacity, a municipality in the state of Paraná in the southern region of Brazil. Sturmer received her BA in Economic Sciences with training in Cooperativism and Development from the Federal University of Fronteira, Sul, and her MA in Agroecology and Sustainable Rural Development from the same institution. She's also a member of the October 4th of the Emergency Brigade of Solidarity with the Mozambican people. Currently, she's on the board of the Vitória Agricultural Production Cooperative and coordinates the FINAPO Pproject department, both linked to the MST. She develops projects in the area of public policies for territorial development, agrarian reform, solidarity economy, and agroecology, with emphasis on women's groups, agro-industries, Quilombola communities, and Guarani indigenous people. Cristina will present today in Portuguese. So for those who don't speak Portuguese, like me, we have live interpretation. Please go to the interpretation tab at the bottom of the Zoom screen and click on the English channel. After the presentation, I will engage in conversation briefly with Cristina, and then we'll open it up for questions from the audience. So welcome, Cristina. Bienvenida, Cristina.
Hello, good afternoon. It's a pleasure to be here with you. I would like to first and foremost thank you for giving me this space and thank you for the effort you have made in providing this interpretation so that language would not be a barrier for us to talk about such important themes. And I will try to speak slowly and because I know that speaking Portuguese and the translation process is very challenging. So I'll be speaking slowly. And Diego and Tatiana, if you feel like I got carried away from talking too fast, please let me know. Well, when Professor Zach invited me, I thought about it and I thought about how I could have a dialogue about the experience that I have in the social movement I'm a part of in this 40 to 45 minutes we're going to have to talk. So I made a choice, and I hope that this choice will allow us to have more than answers, but questions that will allow for a very interesting debate. And so I'm Cristina, you can call me Chris. I am an activist of the Landless Rural Workers Movement, MST, in Brazil, and I'm speaking from a small municipality in Brazil by the name of Paranacity, with a little over 9,000 inhabitants. And in addition to being an economist and a researcher, I am also a farmer, and I am a part of a collective settlement. And we're going to understand more about what that is throughout my presentation. But here in the settlement, I live with my wife, my sister, and my mother. And I will share my screen with you. And I will also make this presentation available in the website of the collective. And I kept the presentation in Portuguese because since I do not speak English very well, and I was not comfortable with translating some specific terms that would not really perhaps translate into what they actually mean. So I will share my screen. Well, the approach that I'm going to try and adopt here is about how agroecology and the production of food that is free of poison and includes other social practices and the seeking of territory rights makes a lot of sense in the thinking about the future of Black people in Brazil. So the theme of this presentation will be agroecology and fight for land, building the future in Brazil. And I will try to divide my intervention into three main blocks. The first one, I will talk a little bit about uh, the fight for land, social movements, and agrarian reform in Brazil, and tell you a little bit about the MST and how the lives of Black people and their life projects fit into this movement. And lastly, I will try and bring forth some issues for us to think about based on a specific experience. Brazil, for those of you who don't know, just to give a little bit of context, it's a huge country and it's full of riches, and it has the majority of its population self-declares as Black, and it's a country that is very unequal, socially unequal, economically unequal, and these inequalities can be materialized in these pictures that I show here of huge urban centers in Brazil, where you have buildings and very urbanized structures and communities in very precarious situations. And thinking about the Brazilian context in comparison to the rest of the world, when we think about what we have today in terms of riches being produced in Brazil, 40% of everything that we have in relation that we produce of riches belongs to 0.2% of the population, and the rest of the population only holds 2% of those riches. And this is not by chance. Brazil, ever since its construction process as a state, it has been going through several processes that create this huge inequality that we have today. And the Brazilian state has consecutively created policies and government plans that uphold the situation of poverty and inequality among our population, both in cities and in the Brazilian rural region. Up until 1930, Brazil was a predominantly rural country, and from that point onwards, the government adopted a policy that caused us to urbanize very quickly and caused us to have a demographic transition, and most of the population a few years later had moved to the urban areas, which also created these inequality scenarios within the city. And bringing the context back to the current times we're going through in Brazil, we're currently going through an election process, a presidential elections. We're approaching the second round of elections, and the dispute is between the current president that adopts a fascist policy and has adopted it in the pandemic and in face of other situations, and he's competing with former President Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva. And this is a dispute between two projects, one that tries to consolidate a fascist policy that is extremely violent towards minority, the LGBTQI plus, uh, Black people, Indigenous people, and the environment, and a project that somewhat thinks about building a unified country and to uphold democracy. So we are in a very tumultuous time. We're campaigning, and there are even some violent clashes between uh, protesters and other forces. And on the 30th of October, we're going to have the second round of our elections. So with this brief introduction of what Brazil looks like today, it's important to get back to some of the bases on which the country was formed. Brazil, in the 522 years it has existed ever since Europeans invaded the Brazilian land up until present day. We have lived for over 300 years under a slavery regime, going through a slavery process that enslaved both African and indigenous people, original people who already occupy this land. So this working relationship shape how social relationships are built in Brazil. 54% of the Brazilian population, which currently self-identifies as Black, and it's submitted to that inequality that I have already mentioned. And beyond that, Brazil has always based its productive relations in the fields in large properties, extensive land that would be controlled by the dominant class. And this has the name of latifúndio in Portuguese. So these huge land extensions that were worked uh, on by enslaved people are a mark of Brazil. And these huge extensions of land become a problem for the country, considering that a division of the land and of these territories, which we refer to as agrarian reform, has never been done. So the land, this disproportionate division of land was never solved throughout the Brazilian history. And the population always had movements that claim right to these lands. So let us imagine a population that once it was freed from slavery, it had nowhere to go in the cities, but also didn't have any space in the rural regions where you could work and live.
Da desigualdade, né, de você, de uma pequena parcela da...
Basically,
Olá.
this issue of
Posso continuar? Tá. Ok, Diego. De uma pequena parcela da população.
due to a very small of the population to have access to land, we have a history of fighting and social organization of these populations that were left in the margin, and it goes from the organization of the enslaved people that ran away, that would seek their freedom and would organize in something that we call Quilombo, the former Maroon populations, and people with their self-management that would resist to the slavery process up until the process of armed fights of peasants and the peasant population that did not have access to land, such as the Canudos revolt or the creation of the peasant leagues. Those are organized movements of people that would protect that would secure land for them to work. And out of that, we see the rural landless workers movement, which is what I'm part of. And this will start in 1984 during the period of redemocratization of Brazil. We have a long dictatorship, military dictatorship, where all rights were revoked, and we see a very hard situation with a lot of suffering for Brazilian population that involved torture, death, and different crimes against the nation. And the Landless workers movement comes as a movement that will organize the different mass of people that would have access to land, and it would be able to work on land. It will organize the people towards this fundamental right of having access to land. The origin of the landless workers movement is linked to a search of a basic right that is in the Brazilian Constitution. So within our Constitution, we have an article that talks about the need or that all land to have a function, a social function. And when the social function is not being observed, it may be disappropriated and used for agrarian reform. So this may contribute somehow to the good, to the development, and to the place where it is positively. So territories that are areas that were taken from the federal government, or you have any type of slave work or lands that are not productive, they must be disappropriated and used for agrarian reform. And it's important to highlight about a very important tool that the landless workers movement use and for us to differentiate between two terms. So one thing is what is written in the law. As we do not have agrarian reform, as we have the inequality of land distribution, we have a law that comes for that to be sorted out. Unfortunately, we have a distance between the reality and the law, and the landless workers movement work towards making this law to actually be observed and to be enforced. And we see as the main instrument the land occupation. So if a land is detected, we see it as not being productive, it's not following its social, we occupy that land and we create a camp. And this is a picture. This is a picture of 1996 of an occupation of one of these areas, and this was one of the largest occupations we've done, and this has originated after this land was occupied and became a camp. It was the origin of a settlement that, well, we had a single family back then, and well, there was a single family back then, and now in that single land we have over 1,700 families settled. So this land was divided, and the people were able to work and live in those areas. So with this introduction on what the landless workers movement is, so it's been 38 years of existence, and and as organization, the landless workers movement has these three main objectives, which is to fight for the land, to fight for these areas, and through the strengthening of other social movements, to fight for this land to be distributed, for an agrarian reform to in fact take place, and to be divided among the population that actually needs it. But also it puts as one of its objectives the process of fighting for the social transformation, understanding that agrarian reform alone, only the division of land, will not solve all the issues of the population that is organized. So the situation of inequality that we see, it is much more complex, and it goes through a process of social transformation focused on the transformation of the relations between us in society and the environment. In this trajectory of 38 years, just for you to understand it, the landless workers movement, well, it has as its area of performance some 450,000 settled families. Those are the ones that have gone through this process of occupying and construction of a settlement, and to have, well, gotten the land through the fight. And each family has 4 people. We reach 1 million people settled, people linked to the social basis. And these families, they are organized in 160 cooperatives. And we have in the Brazilian context, we have the collective organizations focused on the production within the settlements, and those 120 cooperatives, this group of families, they also organize 120 agro-industries that process from they process the most diverse varieties of foods, from the processing of legumes to juice and flour, and even putting the MST as the largest producer uh, of organic and producer and processor of rice, organic rice. So we have 160, 120, oh, I'm sorry, 1900 associations for groups. Those are groups of family that are gathered for not only for production. Our group has an organicity that goes from the settlement, from the land where the families are, it goes through a regional organization up until a national organization. And that happens with the work groups or the work fronts as well. And I have in this box here the sectors that the movement organizes, where I have task forces or groups that are thinking from the local camp up into the national government. So we are organized in this sector that thinks about the maintenance of office, which is the mass front, as we call. We have the training sector, the education sector, production, gender, human rights, health, funds or finances, foreign relations, culture, youth, and LGBT, Landless LGBT. So we have an internal organization and we make that available to the settled families. So just an example, we have our more recent sector, which is the Landless LGBT. So it comes from the discussion of the landless workers that are LGBT. And historically in the movement, we debate things, in this case, the sexual diversity, and how can we tackle this fight for land under this scope. So that's how this, so you see, once again, it's not only fight for land, but fight for social transformation. So I myself, I am part of the production sector because I'm a manager of a cooperative, and I'm part also of the LGBT Landless discussing diversity. And trying to make it easier for us to understand this creation and how it has to do with the lives of Black families, I have brought this picture, this child in the middle here. This is me. I don't think I changed that much. And in 1994, together with my mother and my father, uh, we created for this MST organization in Campo Bonito in the state of Paraná. This was a mobilization of complaints because one of our landless workers, he was murdered recently in that land, in that area. So we were joining together and mobilizing to protest and to make a formal complaint and request answers from the authorities. My mother and my father, they are two landless workers, but they are the ones the the two people that you can see how different the characteristics of the people and what the landless workers movement brings. My mother, her name is Claudette. She's a militant of the landless workers movement since 1982, and before that, she was part of the the religious land uh, group. So basically, this organization was doing social work within the Lutheran Church. So this process and its involvement led her to be closer to this progressist field, and due to the very discussions, she was getting closer to the landless workers movement. And the origin of her family, they were family producers in the state of Paraná, that they came from Rio Grande do Sul, another state in the southernmost state of Brazil. And they were able to acquire a piece of land, a plot of land, and they were able to work that there. But when the so-called conservative modernization of Brazil happens, this is a transition that I talked about, the field to the city. My grandfather and grandmother, they would not be able to remain on land. They had to sell it and go to the city. And so this field identity was very clear with my mother. And when she finds the landless workers movement, she sees that makes a word of sense, and she starts working the occupation process. And she camps for a while until she becomes a settled person, as we call one. My father, his name is Elson, and he's in the movement since 1988. And the movement, he received the nickname of Zombie. And my dad, well, is the third son of a 9 sibling family, and he was the one that got closer to his with his family to the fights uh, in the movement. So, and then my grandfather joined the fight, and other of their siblings were part of MST. On the other hand, on my mom's part, my grandfather and grandmother on my father's side, they never had land. They were they worked for other farmers, or they leased the land. Um, and in this process, they were my dad was able to study, and he was he started studying to be a priest in a seminar. And so in this bonds with the Catholic Church, he gets closer to the social justice movement, and he learns a bit more about racial justice as well, and he joins the movement. So those are two very different stories that show a lot the landscape on of the formation and how people are excluded, either since forever and have no access to land, like my grandparents from my father's side, or when they had land. When Brazil goes through this modernization of agriculture and this process of transferring the people to cities, people lose their lands. And this is just one example of some of the backgrounds that bring people closer to the MST and find in it a, a way to fight for the rights, but also to build their life projects. In this path of 38 years, back in 2014, we, MST, has a national congress or national seminar to think what lines we're going to organize, under what guidelines are we going to work. And we have delegations of 23 states where the MST has present, and it's a week-long debate and dialogue process, and also the organization of the strategic lines to the next period. In 2014, we have defined what is written here, which is the agrarian program of the MST, and seeing the landscape of the agribusiness and the process of internationalization, or a strong participation of international capital, foreign capital in agriculture. So it's not our own relation of the workers looking for the rights, fighting for the rights with the landowner. Now the production relations are linked much more with international affairs, and they're much more permeated by financial capital. So now have multinationals to tackle as well in the Brazilian agricultural area. So you have the agribusiness that was within the structure of the state that would make this process even harder. And within this context, and through a very strong reflection of the very need of the involvement with the city population in the construction of a food sovereignty and other thresholds, the MST starts in the concept of agrarian reform that was permeated by the social transformations and in this construction of an agrarian, a popular agrarian reform. In this, and what are we trying to say? What we're trying to what message we want to bring? Well, more and more we're going to try to make the bonds of the field of the farm in the city they are more strengthened, and we'll only be able to have access to this objective. And our ultimate objective is just the agrarian reform and social transformation. Only if we get closer to have close relations to the city, and this change makes us to take on different guidelines, and we can advance with other, well, even flags in the movement, and with those other flags, they will go through the strengthening of the decisions that we've had, and one of them is the production of healthy food. And I have brought different images that you can see here of our food production. They're down in the lands, or in areas, or in camps, or settlements by men and women that are within the production area of the movement. So it's channeled uh, towards agroecology, as you can see, this way of producing with a dynamic balance with the environment, respecting the people and the communities that are within that land.
And most of all, by engaging in a process of political fight. And so agroecology for our movement uh, is part of this broader movement that is not only producing healthy food, and this is based in a process of accumulation of knowledge in our training centers, because one of the sectors that I mentioned is training and the other one is education. So we build spaces that are schools or institutes that are focused on debating field issues, Brazilian reality, and thinking about alternatives. So this first picture here is a mural in one of those centers, which is the Agroecology School Milton Santos in the municipality of Maringá,
E já formou várias turmas
which
de
has existed for 20 years and has trained several technicians in agroecologies and professors in partnership with public Brazilian universities as a way of uh, solidifying this knowledge and proposing alternatives for the issues we face. And something else I would like to highlight in this popular agrarian reform process is the participation of women and how women have been occupying these spaces and also proposing alternatives that make sense within context they are inserted. And just to give you an idea, in one of the congresses of our movement, we made a decision to have gender parity within all of our instances. So if we have a coordinator for an activity, we have a male coordinator and a female coordinator. And this is true for all instances of our movement. And this caused women to be able to guarantee their presence in the spaces and propose different conditions. So this is a banner for March 8th, which for us women, it is not a day for celebration, but a day for protesting. And in 2020, 2021, due to the pandemic, the team was sowing resistance against violence, because during the pandemic, domestic violence within the movement's territory increased, and in Brazil as a whole increased. And this was brought forth as a, a moment to protest that. And within this movement, we also discussed the social transformation that starts in thinking about how we can change relationships with each other and with the environment. And thinking about two elements that I believe really emphasize the idea behind popular agrarian reform, I will highlight two actions, which is the planting trees and producing healthy food plan and the solidarity actions that were carried out by the movement in the last year. So in the year of 2020, as a response to the increase in deforestation in Brazil, especially in the Amazon, the movement launched this national plan by the name of Planting Trees and Producing Healthy Food. And in this plan, we proposed planting within our territories and outside of our territories 100 million trees in a 10-year period. And this plan has been already implemented for 2 years, this initiative, and we have been strengthening this campaign with building tree nurseries and also planting a lot of trees and recovering many trees. So up until 2030, we hope we can meet that target. And this shows our relationship with the wider society, the broader society, and the fact that we're always proposing initiatives. Uh, and still connected to this discussion of popular agrarian reform and how we can build this field and city relationship, we also have solidarity actions and charity actions carried out during the pandemic. Due to the characteristics of the government we're currently under in Brazil, a lot of people were or became COVID deniers, and the government itself uh, created a very high level of mortality through its policy, and we have lost many lives during the pandemic. And in addition to that, we have an economic stagnation process in several territories due to quarantine, and the populations that were already in a vulnerable situation, especially in the slums of the city, were inserted in an even worse context. So all of the territories, all of our settlements and camps and cooperatives in our movement got organized spontaneously initially, but then in a form that was more organized to donate food within those territories that were vulnerable. And an example is from the state where I live, the state of Paraná. We have donated from April 2020 until last month 1 million kilos of food in the different directions that actions that we engaged in, and over 100,000 meals. And when I think about Brazil as a whole, in our entire territory, we donated 6 million kilograms of food and 1 million meals to these vulnerable populations, especially urban periphery and slums. And just to conclude, I think my time is almost up. Just to conclude, after giving you this overview about what this social movement is and how we engage in these processes inside the territories and our 38-year-long fight for rights, how the Black population that is part of the movement can also, within collective action, build spaces, and the movement also engages in anti-racist action. When we think about Brazil, in the general context, we have this process that is being referred to by scholars as the Black youth genocide. Every 23 minutes in Brazil, a young Black person is murdered by the several instruments, either by the police or by other sectors. So it's a very significant violent situation that is unprecedented, really. And just to conclude, I want to propose a reflection about how agroecology and the fight for land can contribute to building other conditions that are improved for the society. So this picture here, you saw this man a little bit younger in a Another picture, this is my father, Zumbi. He passed 2 years ago by natural causes. He had a health problem, but in the 54 years in which he lived and engaged in the movement ever since 69, he built a trajectory for the production of healthy food through agroecology, and also engaged in a procedure of bringing within the MST the racial discussion and the building of alternatives to racism. And my father was able to study due to the movement support, and he was an agronomist, had a master's in agronomy, and he was the first Black person to graduate in the agronomy course in the State University of Maringá, a public university, in 2001. So just to give you an idea of the context of inequality that we still have in these spaces, especially in the state of Paraná, in the south region of Brazil. So in his trajectory, he was able to contribute to the organization of public policies uh, in agroecology, and he was the president of the National Committee for the Policy of Organic Food Production, which during the Dilma government in 2014 was the agency that elaborated a national feeding policy that included organic food in state policy in Brazil. So in his trajectory within the movement, he brought forth several discussions, and he was a reference for many people within the process. And he always had a very strong message, which is our collective organization process to think about territories and to think about the need to transform our relationship with the environment through agroecology and through people is the path forward for us to build a future that is possible and that encompasses the diversity of people we have in all spaces. In thinking about this, how can we learn here in, in the Brazilian case to think about this collective action and the transformation process? For us, the future is based on ancestrality. So how can we get back to thinking about the organization of our original peoples in our territory that had another relation, a different relationship with the space, with the environment? And how can we think about the organization of the quilombos, the maroon societies, their self-management and their respect to the territories? And how can we, as Brazilian society, heal this open wound, which is slavery and this inequality produced by it, based on this process, build a possible future for the Brazilian population? Well, I think that that's what I had to say. I hope I wasn't going too fast, and I hope it was my presentation was rich and understandable. Thank you very much for giving me the space.
Chris, thank you very much for that generative and very informative presentation. Right now, we're gonna move on to the Q&A section of our session. I'm gonna start with 3 questions, and then I'm gonna open up for other people in the room, in the Zoom room. I want to start when you started presenting, right? You contextualize the current time, the current historical times in Brazil, and you talked about the election, the current election, and you talked about, right, the how right now there's we have Jair Bolsonaro representing fascism, right, right-wing fascism, and then we also have Luis Ignacio Lula, right, representing democracy and unity. Yeah, but I also would like you to comment also on their particular approaches to land, to deforestation, and to the protection of ecosystem and indigenous people, right? Because in a way, there is a fight against fascism and democracy, but it's also there's a lot of stakes regarding the ecology, right, and the Amazon and the survival of indigenous people. So I would like to, if you can like share some thoughts on that aspect of the election and how these two figures are like clashing in terms of ideologies and ecological ideologies.
Fazemos bloco ou eu já
So
respondo?
will it be a block of questions, or I'll answer as it goes?
You can just, if you want to like address the question that I just asked, and then like we can open the room to other questions. Yeah.
A situação dos povos
Well,
originários
the situation of the originary populations with the Bolsonaro administration and this proximity that he has with the radical agribusiness people, we have seen an increase in the process of violence that was huge over the rural communities, and especially the indigenous people, and in the Amazon as a whole. So we saw, but the wildfires that we saw, even the criminal fires that made the cities in the south of Brazil to go dark. So you see, there was such a large amount of smoke in the Amazon that the city of São Paulo was dark during the day for the amount of smoke there was. So it was a very desolating situation. And we have adopted, this president has adopted this discrimination against the indigenous peoples, but not only with them, the former Maroon, the Quilombola combinations, the formerly enslaved people, they have descendants that still do not own land. So he has this practice against this population, both with words, but also armed militia that in fact go and burn these lands and persecute the leaderships with murders and other cases of violence. So, well, I've had the opportunity of doing the work with the Guarani indigenous community in the state of Paraná, several communities in the beginning of the year. And at the very moment they were creating this camp in Brasilia, I don't know if you saw that the originary populations from the different ethnicities, they camped in Brasilia. Then basically denouncing the ground zero of the demarcation of indigenous lands, and on that land, when we saw different dialogues and different reports of the violence and how the state has been acting upon the indigenous population. So the populations, they had to organize differently, similar to what happened in the capital in Brasilia, and they still resist, as we saw in the history of Brazil. So in order for them to try and maintain the little territory they still have in the Amazon region, which is not only in the state of of Amazonas, but Amazon region is it's even more desperate, because you have it's very isolated, and sometimes it takes long to the information to arrive there. With regards to the electoral process, we've had some advances the indigenous population were able to achieve, which is the federal representatives, indigenous federal representatives that take that to the House. Several of them were elected. We see the strengthening of the populations in that sense. The dialogue with Lula is something different. President Lula, he opens for this, and even though he's close to agribusiness, well, he has a different policy with regards to the environment and deforestation as well. So there is this opening to think about this rural populations.
Yeah.
So during this during the administration, during his two administrations, in fact, he created different structures of the states that would contribute to that, from the Ministry of Agrarian Development that would focus on that, up until different policies that would contribute to the communities, not only the indigenous, but also the former Maroon, the Quilombola communities. Thank you.
Yeah. I would like also to talk about the influence, of the historical Maroons and the Quilombos. At the Black Studies Colloquium, we have dedicated a different events and presentation on the topic of Maroons and how can we learn about Maroons. And actually, I wanna bring back the question that you posed at the end, and how to learn from collective action from that tradition of the Maroons, right? And you have that beautiful phrase, "Zombie present," that has been so important for Black Brazilian people. So I would like your thoughts on that. How to learn, from the Maroons, because we're also at the Black Studies Colloquium, we're also learning, right? And it also has become part of our curriculum.
Uma ótima pergunta, uma ótima pergunta.
It is a great question, honestly. Well, I don't believe there is this there is a formula that would allow us to gather all the knowledge from them, but because it's something very complex and history based. But within agroecology, we've done different movements in a sense of, well, first and foremost, open the space to learn, because the way we have a significant hardship to, in fact, hear what those populations are going through, and to try to restore that knowledge in the most open way possible. So there's an expression within agroecology, which is the agroecological transition. It is a process that when you were working conventionally, you would change the way to work to try and build the agroecological process that will reach a stage that that you not use more, well, poison or pesticides and stuff of that sort. I believe this will of learning is in this very field of the transition.
So a first step would be to listen and rescue what these populations have to contribute, and then go through a process of questioning the assumptions we're making, because since we have this contamination, this contaminated view, we sometimes ask the wrong question. We have a problem in asking the question, in formulating the right question to get the answer of how this can strengthen. And in the dialogues we have had, the focus point would be the change in a worldview of how we understand the world and how we understand life. I don't have the book here, but Krenak, Tom Krenak, an indigenous leader, he has a book by the name Life is Not Useful. And he belongs to a specific indigenous people from Minas Gerais. He deconstructs this idea of understanding that life is useful. Why should life have to serve a purpose? Because according to his people, life is meant to be lived and lived as one with the environment and with the world. And this is the same thing I have been seeing in my experience with the Maroon Quilombola population. In a while back, in 2016, I worked with a Quilombola community in the state of Paraná, and we uh, created an agro-industry process for the processing of pepper and other things, because they had a very specific a recipe of hot sauce that was very famous among the community, and they wanted to sell it to complement the income of the community. And they were going through a resistance process because they were located in an area that belonged to a German group, and they were having this fight for land. And in that moment, sometimes concepts like efficiency and productivity that I mentioned, this was not their goal. How viable that business would be had to be approached differently. If they were able to uh, make ends meet, it was great. It was important to them to produce that product and engage in an activity as a group. And this collective aspect, and this goes in opposition to many other paradigms that are more Western. And it's part of the process of resistance. So these are two elements that I would like to list. This need to be open and rethink some assumptions that we make, and this reviewing of what we understand as the world, as life.
Thank you. My last question before opening it up for the audience, it's if you could talk about, you mentioned, right, how the movement right now it's very intersectional, right? And there's cultural workers, agricultural workers, youth, LGBTQ people, families, right? And I would like to know more about how this process of coalition have taken place, through time, right? How that unity, and the difficulties of achieving that unity has happened, within the movement.
Several challenges that still persist. It's a process that is very dynamic, and there's a lot of conflict because it involves the deconstruction of things that are very basic to the forming of the Brazilian society and of a capitalist society as a whole. And we understand that we are not the problem. The individual is not the problem, and the individual act of individuals has an influence, but the problem are the bigger structures. So racism is structural. The patriarchy and sexism are structural problems. So what form of collective actions we can engage in to face up to these structural issues, and thinking about the movement, the peasants movement and the rural workers movement, as is our case, we have some added challenges because we're not working only with an urban population, because there is a process of formation of that individual who lives in the fields that has a more apparent sexism or certain expressions in their way of being, which are more quote unquote violent. And even when we think about racism, it's another context. So some things are very prejudiced against traditional peoples as well, are also very strong and very pervasive. So the first thing is understanding that these are structural issues, but that we must do something that is more connected to collective actions to face up to these things. And having within our structure elements that guarantee the inclusion of men and women, children, and also spaces to report certain behaviors is also important. So within the movement, we have a structure that allows us to deal with the contradictions as they arise, and especially building objective conditions for participation. So thinking about women, for example,
Mhm.
we had a political definition that women would be a part of all of the instances of the movement in their coordination. So we have men and women. But if I don't have a process to provide for childcare that is collective and that
Mhm.
is not only the
Mhm.
women's responsibility, that's not going to happen because women are
Mhm.
mothers. And in the society that we live, the mother will be responsible for taking care of their child's needs. So we need to have a structure for childcare. So here we have a program by the name of Ciranda, which is kind of like a daycare. It's not
Mhm.
a daycare, but it is a space where children, where their fathers and mothers are uh, participating in the group's activities, they can be taken care of. So that's collective. If you go to a MST meeting, we're gonna have a ciranda so that the women who are bringing their children are the children are taken care of. And this is the responsibility of our education sector. And if I have a case of LGBTQI plus phobia within the movement, I have within the LGBT collective instruments that are provided to investigate that report and for a process either of awareness raising or a type of sanction that will be necessary. So this process of bringing these issues inside the movement and create actual structures really contributed to our movement, and a self-criticism process that is ongoing. So looking at things we did that were not that great and recharting our course, and training and capacity building has been essential. As I mentioned, we have several capacity building segments, and we also produce several uh, educational materials, and we provide awareness raising and capacity building courses. So this is uh, a value that we have. If we want social transformation, we need to train ourselves for social transformation. So that's why we have a specific capacity building sector that thinks about how that's going to be done within the territories.
Chris, we have a question in the chat, so I'm going to read it. This is from Dr. Erika Richardson, Professor Richardson. She says, what assumptions do you think the state or outside interests have about who should own land in Brazil? How does MST change the way we think about the way people can relate to land, or who we can imagine and recognize as having land?
Ela perguntou se no exterior, quem do exterior? Tá bom. Entendi. Entendi, beleza, obrigada, Thalita. Sim, ok, vamos lá.
Okay, I was just reading back the question to her. So it is in the interest of the Brazilian state that figure, that role of the landowner is upheld large extensions of land that produce only one thing. And sometimes that thing that is being produced is not even food for the Brazilian people. So in Brazil, we have the production of a category that is food for non-eating purposes, which is animal feed, um, for other types of animals like cattle raising. So food for non-eating purposes. And most of the territory is at the hands of these landowners, which either produce that or do cattle raising for the production of meat and use land as merchandise. And the land is not well managed because they use agricultural practices that completely destroy the land. So us Brazilians are the largest consumers of poison, and it's the amount of contaminated rivers that we have. So researchers collect samples and test our waters and find a lot of poison in the water. And in breast milk in some regions, even in the state of Mato Grosso and in the Midwestern region of the country, where we have studies that show the presence of poison in breast milk. So all of this is a result of using land as merchandise and several other types of merchandise that are being sold that uphold that system. And this moves the cogs of that wheel and causes all of those results. So there is international interest even that is significant for the upholding this type of situation, because it's not the Brazilian people that is gaining from this. And the state, according to the structure that we currently have, is an accomplice to the situation. Even when we had the Lula and Dilma uh, administrations, some things were changed, but structurally, this was not dealt with. And we didn't have widespread agrarian reform in the country. So the basis of that system are still maintained and are extremely lucrative, not for the Brazilian people, but for large enterprises and multinational companies who sell seeds and pesticides. And thinking about us and other rural communities, how we understand land. We understand land as a part of our lives and the way in which we live and in which we occupy that land. So a family that is of settlers who occupy land in a camp and is living in that space, they understand that space as a part of themselves. So that is a very strong connection with land. And that's the challenge, building other forms, which is not that proposed by agribusiness, to produce food. And that's why we took on this challenge to produce healthy food, because you usually have a package that we buy of products and seeds that we plant and sell. So how can we do this differently within our territories? So we don't deal with it as merchandise. We don't think of production as always planting, 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 and not worrying about the land at all.
There's another questions in the chat. It says, is there land taxing in Brazil? Is there land taxing in Brazil?
Well, there is a very small tax by the name of IPR, which is the land tax, but it is not a very significant tax. In the fiscal structure of Brazil, we have what we called a type of taxation that affects the people who earn less income, because our taxation system, our tax burden is mostly on food and merchandise, and does not necessarily include income or uh, land ownership. So you have the tax on income, which is one of the taxes that is charged in Brazil, that impacts people who earn up to a certain level of income. Is proportional. So if I earn 100,000 reais, and if I earn 10,000 reais, I basically pay the same tax. So it impacts poor people and doesn't really consider income. We don't have tax on fortunes, for example. And there is a very heavy tax burden on food. So there is a tax by the name of ICMS, which is a tax on merchandise and the circulation of merchandise that taxes any type of merchandise. So it doesn't matter how much I earn, I'm going to be paying the same level of tax if I want to buy a water bottle than someone else who earns 10 times more than me. So this is a very unequal system, including in the taxation process.
We have another question. Professor Mampili has a question, rose his hand. So please go for it, Professor Mampili.
Well, thank you so much for this, Chris. It was really exciting and illuminating to hear what MST is doing in Brazil. I have a question for you in terms of some of the international work that MST does. I know that you guys try to bring people to Brazil to learn about some of your strategies and your campaigns. And I think that raises the question for me in terms of how we think about what MST is doing in Brazil, but also I think for the world, right? Specifically, Brazil is a country that is very susceptible to international markets. It's a resource-dependent country, and it is very reliant on foreign direct investment in ways that are sort of out of the control of the national government. So when Lula was president and there's a commodity boom, everybody's happy. But when commodity prices drop, then everybody's angry at Lula, even if it has nothing to do with who the president is in any given moment. And I guess my question then is, how do you, as an organization, address some of these international dynamics, right? So things that are outside of the control of the Brazilian government, but may actually have a hugely important role in shaping the livelihoods of poor Brazilians in particular, things that are operating at these international levels of global capitalism.
Well, we have attempted since the beginning of the movement, thinking about what everything is under the Brazilian law and what comes from the Brazilian state and what comes from outside, which is the creation of the so-called internationalism, this understanding that only the that the movement will be able to sort everything. Now we understand that the movement won't have even the knowledge necessary to deal with everything that is happening. So we're part of some international instruments of the fight in the fight of the peasant movements, such as Via Campesina, a movement that joins together different social movements in the field around the world, and that helps us strengthening, especially in those issues that are much bigger than ourselves, and that will reach our Brazilian population one way or another. And on this issue of internationalism, and to try and strengthen the relationships with other agents that could contribute to this type of tackling and this type of issue, we also organize a process of international solidarity with other peoples and other lands to try and build this solidarity network with them for both learning from what affects not only us, like for instance the multinationals, in the agrochemical system, they are in other lands, and other populations are using different strategies to tackle them. So how can we learn and strengthen that process with what we have in Brazil, and how they can strengthen us as well? So thinking about that, we have this process. We have a brigade that was part of. We call them brigades. Those are the groups of militants that goes to different lands, different areas, to have exchanges with other populations and other social movements. It was in 2019. This was a very specific brigade to Mozambique, together with a Decro movement, with the Decro movement, that in that political scenario that was completely different from ours, but very similar somehow as well, with with how the neoliberal policies are implemented and bring vulnerability to the people. So basically, we have an exchange program with them to show solidarity, because there was a catastrophe that was happening there with the floods that happened in Mozambique as well, due to the Dai cyclone. So we had contact with other strategies to tackle uh, the issues that with a collective, it has contributed to create a relationship with these people and think differently. So besides the participation and the COP, we have permanent brigades. In some spaces, we have one militant brigade that is in Zambia, called the Amora Mache Brigade, that is in Zambia and contributes to this collective systematization and other things that are happening in the territory. We have a brigade in Venezuela, also with this dialogue and collective construction. We have a brigade in Haiti, the Salinas Brigade, that only stopped due to the pandemic, but they still have infrastructure there, and one in Cuba. So this process of construction of this internationalism, and to try and create these links with people and organizations that are not happy about the situation that we live, and this allows us to create connections to try and strengthen these alternatives. But it is a whole process that we need to go through. Thank you. I don't know if I answered your question. I hope those are.
We have time for one last question, and we have one in the chat. So it says, this is from Pra. He's saying, how is MST capitalizing or using social media for the advancement of the movement?
This is a very recent fight that we're learning how to fight. So the campusing movement with rural communities, and this advance in audiovisual, both in audiovisual, but also in the propagation of these ideas. This is something that we are taking ownership recently. We have attempted to have this fight with the ideas in social networks, but due to the very accumulation of the culture, or the we had several symbols and practices and songs and many things in the advertisement and propaganda, and to translate that to social media was something that the pandemic made us being stronger in the conventional social media, Facebook and Instagram, and to try and strengthen our dialogue with society, but also the production of content that would give visibility to what the movement does. Because in the Brazilian common sense, we're a land we're land grabbers, terrorists. We just want the land, and in the zeitgeist, that's it, and that we do not work, so we see the discrimination, and due to prejudice uh, against who the landless workers are, and this is something that we strengthen ourselves more, and we are having very interesting results. Even in my presentation, I have shown some references of our website and the videos on YouTube that we have produced. And if you want to take a look at that, we have it's that it's at MS on Instagram is at MST underline official. And if you search that on Google, you see the website of the movement that is full of different materials. So we're learning how to fight this fight in social media. Thank you.
So I'm gonna thank you very much, Chris. I'm gonna pass the mic to Erica because she has some final words for us.
Thank you so much, Chris, for an incredible presentation. I know that I am going to be walking away today thinking a lot about how land is turned or made into merchandise, but how we can change that, and how MST does perform these moments of social transformation to really consider, what assumptions do we make about who can own land, what is its purpose, and how by changing that we can actually shape and create a better future. So really brilliant, compelling work. And again, for all of you who are listening, we're going to have access to this presentation. This presentation was the PowerPoint. It was also recorded. And as someone who did go ahead and Google the MST website, it's really cool just seeing the range of work that they do on so many different levels, both local and much as the questions and answers have shown us, building up into an international space to really get us to think about what are Black ecologies and what can those futures look like. This afternoon, we will have another wonderful presentation by another researcher and activist, Colette Pinchon Battle, and it'll be the same link that you have right now. I'm going to, well, I think I've already dropped it in the chat, but just in case, using the same Zoom link, coming back here today at 3:30, we're going to be learning about Colette Pinchon's Colette Pinchon Battle's work with Taproot, a global climate justice organization. Thank you so much, Raj, for dropping that in the chat. So the link is there. We hope to see you all this afternoon. And again, thank you so much, Chris, for your wonderful work.
Eu não sei se pode algumas palavras finais, mas eu gostaria de agradecer.
I just want to thank you all for the space and the effort of this group to receive me and to build this dialogue. It is a great joy to be able to talk and to interact and to to have discussions with people who are thinking about a better future for the population, and also people who believe that ecology and changing the relationship we have with the environment may contribute for a better future. Thank you very much. Thank you for the invitation.
Bye-bye.